April 17, 1945. 10:47 a.m. The sky over Southampton was a broken grey, a delicate, impatient light where rain promised itself and never quite arrived. Margaret Schulz stepped down a gangway and onto British soil. Her uniform still smelled of salt and diesel. Her hands trembled not with cold but with an old, certain fear. A fear that in this moment, any movement might be the last. Around her 67 other women shuffled forward in silence. They had been taught that surrender meant erasure. Speaking drew attention. Attention invited selection. Selection, in the worst of the whispered stories, meant a bullet. But the British sergeant at the foot of the ramp checked a clipboard, waved a translator forward, and spoke a single, bewildering sentence. Medical inspection first. A canvas tent, Red Cross armbands, a smile from a nurse. No rifles. No dogs. The kind of small, mundane mercy that would unmake Margaret's certainty about what strength meant. This is where our story begins, not with speeches in halls or treaties on tables, but with a simple cup of tea and a choice. For 2 years Margaret had lived inside a narrative built to hold a war. Propaganda had been explicit and absolute. The enemy was monstrous. Allied capture meant humiliation, starvation, forced labor, disappearance. When the collapse came in April, and British forces overran the remnants of her unit, Margaret expected cruelty because she had been taught to expect cruelty. Her moral map was complete. What she encountered instead was policy, not sentiment, built on 4 pillars: security, intelligence, diplomacy, and morality. Britain placed prisoners behind wire because security required it. It treated prisoners decently because decency created cooperation, and cooperation yielded intelligence. It honored inspections because reciprocity mattered in inspections. It kept standards because a society that signed the Geneva Convention needed visible integrity. The new reality did not cancel the old narratives. It complicated them, and complication is the strangest shock of all. The medical tent smelled of antiseptic and boiled wool. A doctor checked Margaret's hands, callous from signal equipment, and a nurse offered a tin mug of hot tea with a half-spoon of sugar. Margaret hesitated. In her frame of reference, a gift could be a test, or a trap, or proof that you were weaker than your captors wanted. The nurse took a sip from her own cup and said in halting German, "It's just tea, love. You're safe now." The word landed like a foreign object. Margaret drank. The warmth moved from chest to hands. The trembling stopped. That tin mug, dented, ordinary, standardized, became a symbol. It was a small object, but symbols cut deeper than explanations. A cup in a stranger's hand can tell you whether the world still runs on cruelty, or whether it might, by choice, operate on restraint. It's important to be precise. Britain's treatment of prisoners in 1945 was not accidental kindness. It was deliberate policy. Prisoners were secured, they were fed, they were medicalized, they were processed in ways that made them legible to inspectors and to their own governments. Mortality rates in British camps were low because the system was designed to make them so. That design had consequences. It meant that decency could be predictable, and that predictability reduced resistance and opened channels for information and diplomacy. It also meant that the moral argument for humane treatment took precedence at a national level. Britain, in that moment, chose to show the world a civilization that could restrain itself even when restraint was politically and emotionally costly. From processing centers, the women traveled north to a repurposed country estate in Shropshire. Margaret and a dozen others were assigned to agricultural work, milking, mucking stalls, processing milk into butter and cheese. They learned to do a job they had never done. The farmer, Mr. Hargreaves, was a lean, skeptical man of 63 who spoke little and expected much. On the first morning he demonstrated the milking parlor and said simply, "You'll work 6 hours a day, 6 days a week. You'll be paid in camp script. You'll be treated fairly if you work fairly." The words were unornamented, but they contained an implicit bargain. The women learned fast. By the end of a week, Hargreaves grunted approval. "You'll do." That grunt, a small sign of earned respect, mattered more than any headline. The work was honest and the supervision was firm but not cruel. The rhythm of labor, unlike the rhythm of propaganda, produced competence, accountability, and a fragile, practical trust. Chapter 6: Small Gestures, Big Consequences, 10 o'clock. Over time, gestures accumulated. Mrs. Hargreaves appeared with a basket of scones and poured tea from a thermos. A borrowed coat appeared when rain set in. An invitation to Sunday dinner, roast chicken on a wooden table, careful, ordinary questions about Hamburg, came like a test and an offer both. One of the farm workers, Hilda, was hospitalized with an infection and returned to find that British nurses had asked about her family and meant it. These small, unscripted human acts were not policy. They were choices made by people who were tired and practical and, in small ways, compassionate. They forced a reckoning that slogans could not. There were moments when restraint was tested. A young corporal lost his temper during a work detail, stepped too close, raised his voice. For a breath, everyone in the room expected violence. It did not come. The sergeant intervened, scolded the corporal, and reassigned him. The message was clear: cruelty would not be tolerated. The punishment for violent behavior was not physical retaliation, it was removal and disgrace. That institutional discipline mattered. It turned barbed wire into the punishment itself. It taught a lesson about power. Sometimes true strength is not the capacity to break, but the capacity to refrain. Chapter 8: Language, Letters, and the Slow Rebuilding, 1400 Hours. By spring 1946 a small library appeared, and with it the possibility of a different education. Margaret borrowed a battered copy of Pride and Prejudice, and worked through it with a dictionary, learning an ordinariness she had never been invited to know. Music clubs formed. Americans arrived, smiling, chewing gum, keenly procedural, and their brusque kindness felt to the women like another small reorientation. Correspondence opened slowly. Censored mail became twice monthly. Margaret wrote home. "I am treated fairly here. We work on a farm. I am not beaten. I am not starved." When her mother's reply finally came months later, a letter that had been full of grief and the conviction that Margaret was dead, it exposed a terrible symmetry. Propaganda had poisoned both sides. Margaret's survival and the letter's relief became the first cracks through which doubt, and then understanding, could flow. Repatriation began in earnest in early 1947. Some women returned to Germany to rubble, to families scattered across occupation zones. Some stayed temporarily, working contracts that offered a little more time and a small financial cushion. Margaret left only after one last harvest, one final Sunday dinner with the Hargreaves family. She accepted a parcel to carry home: tea, biscuits, a worn Pride and Prejudice with a note tucked inside. "Remember that decency is always a choice." She took the tin mug with her. For decades it sat on a kitchen shelf, dented, dull, unremarkable. Each time she brewed tea she cradled that ordinary object and remembered a lesson that outlived headlines and borders. Nations are measured not only by their weapons but by what they refuse to do. What can one small story teach us about the vast machinery of history? First, symbols are powerful. A dented tin mug can hold more truth than 1,000 slogans because it anchors lived experience. Second, policy matters. Decency that is embedded in systems, rather than staged for display, has the power to change lives and, with time, reshape narratives. Third, restraint is a form of strength. It asks more of a society than vengeance does, because it requires discipline when emotions scream for the opposite. This is not a story that absolves. It is not a story that erases atrocity or ignores injustice. It is, instead, a story about the human capacity to choose, again and again, to be decent when cruelty would be easier. If you remember one image from today, let it be simple and strange: a woman, trembling, holding a dented tin mug of tea and learning that the world is not as the propaganda told her. The rest of her life, the letters, the farm work, the long friendship with people who were once enemies, grew from that moment. History lives in objects and small acts. If this portrait of Margaret Schulz moved you, please like, comment, and subscribe. Share the video, not because it simplifies the past, but because it insists on complexity, that people can be both victims and agents, that propaganda can be undone, and that rebuilding begins with modest, persistent choices. Thank you for listening. Remember, strength is not what you do to those beneath you, strength is what you refuse to do.